meeting of the special joint workshop of the Village of Lake Bluff Board of Trustees and Joint Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals. Clerk, please call the roll.
Trustee Ankerman. Trustee Briand.
Here.
Trustee Fisher. Trustee Marquis.
Here.
Trustee Rappin. Trustee Ryder.
Here.
President Charlotte.
Thank you.
I'm here, I'm sorry, I know.
We got you.
Thank you.
Do you want to call the roll for PCZBA?
Member Danley. Member Fisher. Member Miller. Member Russell. Member Sorensen. Member Toll is absent. Chair Peters. You have a quorum.
Thank you. Next is our non-agenda items and visitors. The Village President and Board of Trustees allocate 15 minutes during this item for those individuals who would like the opportunity to address the Village Board of Trustees on any matter not listed on the agenda. Each person addressing the Village Board of Trustees is asked to limit their comments to a maximum of 5 minutes. I do not believe we have anybody in the room here. Do we have anybody online?
We do, but no one is raising their hand, Mr. President.
Thank you. So I say we continue with item number 3. That would be the continued plan, residential development regulations and zoning district review workshop with Mr. Blue. Thank you.
Thank you, Village President, members of the board, members of the PCZBA. We're just going to dive in. We have a lot to cover and a limited amount of time. But I'd be remiss if I didn't start by thanking the village staff, thanking the village attorney for their input on all this and getting this to where it's not just a section of code, but it's a section of code that's very much customized to Lake Bluff. Which is what really matters about all this. What I often tell people is that, and I may have mentioned this before, and I apologize if I did, but I'm sort of like the waiter with the menu here. There are a lot of ways to do the things that we talked about at the last 2 workshops and that we've been working on. There's a lot of ways to do it. There are some that, frankly, I feel strongly about. There are some I would recommend, just like a decent waiter might. But there's a lot of ways to do it, and so customizing it and making sure it's for you. Again, staff, village attorney have been a big part of that, and the next step in that is to go through this with you. So with that, then let's dive in. Just to quickly, what we'll talk about tonight, we'll talk about the schedule, where we are in the project. We'll go back to where we started, talk about why did we decide to do all this again? And then we'll go through the draft. And what we've got is a little bit of a brief summary for each section, kind of why we did that. So what I'd like to do is go through that quickly, and then we'll go back to the top and kind of go one by one. And if you have questions, comments, suggestions, we can talk it through as we do that. So just to kind of give you a sense of where we were, it was February of last year when we kicked this off with staff. We first met in June of 2021. We last met last September. In these steps that are up here, and you've seen this before, in these steps that are up here, some of them have been technical in terms of our review of the code, in terms of the village attorney's review of the code. Some of them have been a little more qualitative. These stakeholder meetings were held with a mix of past village officials, architects and developers who specifically work frequently in the village, and those that just generally work in the region and understand the area. So they were very helpful in understanding kind of a global perspective of what we're up to. And then since we met last, we have been going through iterations of this draft and are here tonight to share it with you. The next step will be to consider it for adoption if you're all comfortable with it, or at which point you are all comfortable with it. So the next slide talks a little bit about the objectives. The first reason to do this is that there are desirable outcomes when something goes through the PRD process. You want this to be something that the village is going to be pleased with, that the developer and the community and everybody has a productive experience with. A key point to any type of this process is that we ensure effective community input. And as you know, that's a key part of everything we all do, and that's built into this update here. Understandable code requirements. It's a little longer than it was right? And that's because there's a lot of specificity in it in terms of what's required for submittal, in terms of what the process is, in terms of what the standards are, in terms of referring to other parts of the code. So that helps, while it makes it longer, makes it understandable to people. And then the last thing is I'm a big fan of a predictable review process. And that's a function of what I just said, that as you, as a PCZBA, as a village board, residents, everybody knows what's going to be submitted, what the steps are. Not predictable in terms of we know what the outcome's going to be, but predictable in terms of the process. And that's what we started out to do here. And so here's how we did it. The next slide. So again, what I'm going to do is just run through each of these main sections. You've all had a chance to read this, but just kind of, before getting into the nuts and bolts, just to talk about why we did these things. The purpose statement, well, frankly, it's kind of a legal aspect of the code, but it's important that the purpose spells out to the user what the village's expectations are for the development and the development process. We did this by providing descriptive text, photos, graphics that paint a picture, and I chose those words carefully, to paint a picture of the village. If you've looked at this section and you've looked for it or tried to find it in other codes, I don't think, you'd have to look really hard to find one that's as descriptive or includes pictures and graphics the way this one does. One of the things we heard from stakeholders is, developers come from elsewhere, they just don't know what Lake Bluff is. They just don't know what they're getting, what they're getting into in terms of providing a development style. And the idea was to spell that out, so that as the developer starts working, they have an understanding. The next section talks about the applicability. And so what this does is this spells out what types of developments will be able to go through the PRD process. This is all pretty standard stuff, but the need here was to be clear about it, and we expanded the types of developments that can. Again, the approach to do this was to ensure that the review was applied to larger, more complex types of developments that required flexible application. So that's what we needed and what we did in terms of deciding what developments would go through the PRD process. Again, these are very much policy decisions. If there are types of developments that go through here that as a group, as a village, you decide, well, no, we don't want to do this, that's fine. We should talk about that because there are policy decisions throughout. The next slide talks about common ownership. This is very much just a requirement. You want to deal with one person who's going through the PRD process, both in terms of the review process and after the review process. So you're not chasing multiple owners, that there's one person that clearly has the authority to do this. So this is just a procedural necessity, if you will. The next slide talks about the uses that are allowed in the planned residential development. Again, kind of a standard aspect of code work. What kind of use can you have here? What kind of uses can you have? The decision at this point was to look at it being a wide range of residential uses. So it wasn't just all one type of use, and that also the complementary uses, some of these institutional uses, which are not uncommon in residential areas, especially redevelopment of large residential areas, could be accommodated. That was the approach taken and the goal there. The next section has, well, all these standards, right? So this is where the rubber starts to meet the roads. And the need here was to define the parameters of possible developments, including their density and bulk standards, and how they should be built. And again, the way of doing this was to be very specific in terms of what the standards were, what the expectations were. And I'll say it one more time. A lot of these are best practices. A lot of these things that I've applied or written elsewhere or seen in other places. A lot of this is stuff that we worked out with staff and village attorney to make sure that it was appropriate for the village, but these are in many ways policy choices. The next section talks about public benefit, which is new to the PRD process, but not new to planned developments generally. You'll see most communities that have a planned development ordinance will have some sort of public benefit that's required. The need here is to have amenities that serve the local residents that are part of the development and to the community as a whole. The approach we took was to specify what the village would accept as public benefit. So there's a couple ways to do this. One is to not specify what will be accepted as a public benefit and kind of leave it open as a negotiation. Let's see what the developer, comes up with. What we did is we included a specific list, and this list was built off of, if you think back to the previous workshops that we did, and we had discussions about what's special about Lake Bluff. What do you like? What do you need? What do we want? What do we want to have be part of our community? That's really where that list got developed. So there's a specific list of benefits, public benefits that the village will consider through this process. Next slide is the fun one. This is the process. I will tell you, in all my years of writing and working with codes and attending meetings and board meetings and commission meetings, structure is very important. I go on and on about structure in some of my presentations. I will spare you the gory details. But structure is what helps everybody know what's coming, helps everybody know what's going next, helps the chair of the plan, the PCZBA, and the village president have control of a meeting, has the village keep control of a process. I really, structure is our best friend, and the order of that is spelled out here. And as I mentioned before, the approach here is to be very specific in terms of all that long list of what you have to provide. If it doesn't help, it can be waived, that's fine. But it's spelled out and it's predictable. The next slide details this, and we'll use this when we come back to it. But the step after this, the slide after this, talks about the authority to modify regulations. And what we did here was we established parameters for what could be changed. One of the things that's really important in all of these codes, and it is here, I know, is a question of density, and the question of how much density, how much additional density or how many additional dwelling units can be provided. That's something that all developers come with a question about or a need for. It's something with all residents come with a concern over. You're going to put how many where? So that, among other things, is spelled out here in this section, and we can talk about it more as we get through it. The next section talks about concurrent review. This, again, is more procedural than anything else, but it's not uncommon. Well, the structure of this process is to have a preliminary and final review. And we can go into this more, but the preliminary process is essentially you all looking at everything you need to know about the development and saying, you know what, this is good, we like this. At which point the developer goes off and does all of their final engineering, right? And this saves them having to do all of that final engineering prior to knowing for sure that they have a development that the village has found acceptable. For smaller developments, it may be feasible and reasonably priced for the developer to do both of those steps at one time. And if it's a small enough development, if it's 10 or less, and the village administrator finds that there's merit to this approach, then these two pieces can be done concurrently. Still requires public hearings, still requires public input, still requires all those steps in that process we had before, but the preliminary and final are done concurrently. And last but not least are amendments to an approved PRD. What will happen occasionally is a PRD will get approved, even the engineering will get approved, and the developer will start digging and they will find something different. Or they will want to respond to a change in the market, or something will happen. These are unanticipated changes that come up. Well, the code needs to have rules for what do you do then? Do you just say, okay? Or do you say, nope, you can't do it, you gotta start over? So what the code does now is it establishes minor and major changes. And for minor changes, those can generally proceed. They're determined by the village administrator based on a set of standards that are in the code. If they're major changes, you pretty much have got to start over. So if the village said, here's what we're going to approve, and somebody comes back with something that is so different that it's beyond those standards, that it's no longer a minor change, they pretty much have to go back to the public hearing. That's the whole thing. If it's all right, Mr. President, I thought maybe we would go back to the beginning and ask if there are questions going through, and I realize there's a time constraint. Some of these things are very procedural. We probably don't need to spend a lot of time on them. Some of them probably lend themselves to longer discussion, but.
I have a question actually on this workflow, and I like it. And what is the process for community versus developers in terms of changes? If we got a comment tonight, a community comment, and the concern was, how is this code going to help us if a community has comments or if a developer has modification of a process, are we going to be slanted toward the developer or are we going to be slanted toward the community? What is going to be the balance at that level?
Oh, that's an interesting question. The way that these processes are set up, when they're set up properly, and I think we have that here, is there's really not a slant either way. The structure that I described creates a list of things that the developer has to provide you all, not you, but you all, right? And so if they do that, and they do it in such a way that it meets with the standards of the code and it meets with the development policies of the community, well, then they've done what you've asked of them. And if they have done all that you have asked of them and they have a development that has gone through that long process that was on that chart and met the standards, well, then they probably have met what you want to do, and in all likelihood you would approve it. So that's not really slanted to anybody because it ultimately gets the developer what they came here for, one might say, but it's also set up so that the village, at any number of these stops along the way, if you will, slants the process towards themselves, or slants the process back to itself for the village, because you're reviewing each of these steps. So if one of these things is the traffic study, for instance, and the developer does a traffic study which is, let's say, rather favorable or slanted towards what they're looking to do, it's not unusual for villages to read the traffic study and do an evaluation of it, or have a third-party traffic engineer do the evaluation and say, well, you know what, you've completely missed A, B, and C. You've not looked at these parts of the process, or you've not looked at this direction the traffic comes from, or you've calculated the left turns in a way that is out of standard practice. Go back and do it again. Right? And so the village is always kind of a check on the process and pulling back on it to make sure that it's what you all need to make your decision. I would suggest to you, and there are lawyers in the room and on TV, I'm not the lawyer, is that in many ways, the process is always slanted towards the village because you're going to vote yes or no. There will be a recommendation and there will be a vote. And I would think of that as the ultimate slant because you have the ultimate decision, and that's the way it should be.
So I should not have used the word slant, but you did answer with the process will address all the relevant points in order. And that would be the answer. Thank you.
Great.
Hi. I have a couple of questions that I think were contained in the same correspondence that you were referencing. And so I want to go down to the first observation that was made, and that's in 1017-2. So there's several significant differences between this and our old one of which was, or is, I should say, a 6-acre minimum, yes. And rather than carve that back to 3 acres or even 1 acre, we seem to have gone entirely the other direction, in as much as it refers in D to any parcel or combination of parcels, to which I read that could be a lot, right? One lot, one parcel. And then the next thing that's said is the proposed development would require, number 2 is the proposed development would require more than one variation or modification. I didn't spend a lot of time on the PCZBA, but enough time to know that many times we're faced with more than one variation or modification. So to what extent does this formerly limited PRD ordinance now encompass potentially everything? Every time somebody wants to build a single-family residence with 3 variations, for example. And perhaps I'm just reading it incorrectly. I just wanted to start with that very fundamental question and ask if that's what we intend.
I think the goal, and based off the comments that were received to date to the workshop, was to push more development through this process, which has more elements of control, more defined procedures, more requirements for application submittal, and it really creates more control for the village by design.
Yeah, so it seems to me that everything
And that
other
is
than
bigger.
Yeah, a lot bigger,
It is.
right?
But that was the feedback, that was the direction. Is it too big, is what your question is?
Well, I just, when I read through that, I knew we were going down from 6 acres. I knew we were going down to, significantly smaller potential districts. But when I thought of it in the terms that are set out there in 2D, it subsumes potentially the entire other process that we've lived with today, right? For anything other than a home that's going to be built with one or fewer modifications, or variations, I'm sorry. Right? I just want to put out there that that's, my understanding is that's what we're proposing here. And to the extent to which that's typical in a PRD ordinance.
If I might jump in, President Charlo.
Yes, of course.
Okay. So one response I would have to that question is, I think, one of practicality. So let's say you have a single family home, somebody who wants to develop a single family home on one lot, and let's say they want to go through this process. The question would be why? Because we do have a process right now for variations. We have other processes, as you indicated, they could go through. And I don't know that this would be a very advantageous process for somebody who might have, a one lot development, because the cost of going through the public hearing, not once, but twice, to go through all, if you look at that chart of preliminary and final, and to go all the way through that, I don't know that would be economical or from a timing perspective, expedient. So I think the idea of having not just for parcels that are 6 acres or larger, but all these other options, is that sometimes when you have something smaller, it still may involve a lot of complexity. And also innovation in development and interesting ideas that come forward. And so it's not atypical to see planned developments used for smaller lots. We're not and if you see in D, it's not forcing an applicant into it, rather they can choose to.
Right.
But then also remember that the village, the PCZBA, as well as the village board, has every opportunity to say, that we don't see eye to eye on this. We don't think you meet the standards, so we're not going to grant you approval. So, again, I don't know on a small lot basis that this is going to be the most practical tool.
I see.
Thank you.
And I guess my second question is this virtually no minimum size, a parcel, what we're seeing in PRD ordinances? Is this typical? And maybe you're not prepared to answer that question as to typicality, but it strikes me as sort of going from one extreme to the other, and I'm trying to get my head around it. So is that, George, I'm sorry.
Please.
George has the answer.
I'm sorry, it sounded like you were done, Susan.
Oh, well, I was, and I was waiting for somebody to have an answer.
Tommy instead of President Charlo. I came in this evening with more ink on this page than the rest of the document, because I have the same concerns that you have. It seems to invite a developer to pursue a multi-family development in any area in the village, right in the middle of an R4 district, if the lot is big enough. But yet these phrases that would require one or more variation or modifications, then that even implies that they could come forward to propose a townhome on a lot that was even undersized and just request a variation for it. There doesn't seem to be any cap on what we're trying to limit here. It opens the complete Pandora's box to aggressive developers approaching the village to particularly put multifamily in single-family districts. And to me, that's a concern. Even if, I know what Ben just said, we've got all these subjective standards, but they're not objective yes or no standards, and there's always interpretation. So I would be very concerned with a code that allows this outright for a developer to even submit the application. That's my concern. And then I do have a question for you, Mike, if you have page 5 open.
Yeah.
A, B, and C, is the word "or" following each one of these semicolons? Any parcel or combination of parcels 60 inches or greater, or any residential
That would
development?
be the intent,
It is-
not an and. Yes, it would be an or.
Provided that the
Okay.
proposed meets one or more.
So I guess I would take a shot at answering this as well. The underlying zoning is still the basis of the review process, right? Use variations are not intended to be part of what's here. If there's going to be a proposal for a mixed use, well, then that is going to come through here. If somebody wants to take a piece of property that is smaller and want to put, let's say somebody wants to put a 4 flat in a single-family district. Yeah, is this how they would do it? Yes, this is how they could do it. This does not in any way obligate the village to let them do it. They may go through a process. I would think that there would be little or no way that they could meet the standards. And again, I'm not the attorney in the room. I always find myself in this position. But they would have to meet the standards that are here to explain to all of you why this idea of having a 4 flat in a single-family neighborhood meets all these standards. And this is written such that you as a commission, you as a board would look at it and say, these are the standards we've considered. You've not met them. The answer is no. And we'll go on a limb and guess that if somebody came into the office and said that to Drew or Glenn, Glenn would say, well, you can ask, but let me tell you what's going to happen. This is what happens in municipal offices all the time. You know this. So that's really the answer. Is this how somebody could do it? Yes. Does this give them the absolute right to do it or even a fighting chance at doing something that's outrageous? I would suggest no. Did we answer your second question, though? I wasn't sure we.
I don't know, maybe there is no
paused and
answer.
jumped in.
I paused because I thought maybe no one had the answer, which is this typical? Is this the way these ordinances are
Somebody
moving?
else might answer, but I'll start. There are a lot of planned development districts that have got different thresholds by which you can enter the process. There are a lot of them where you can request entering the process. There are others where, by the virtue of your size, type of development, you're put into it. So, again, as I said, what we set up here is the thresholds, that's up to us.
Okay.
But the fact that there are multiple things, it's not just the size of the development, that's very common, that there would be more ways to get into the process than that.
So a thought I had when considering this, and then I'll cede the floor, is we start with it needs to be a combination of parcels, not just a single parcel. Because it seems to me we have standards set forth for granting variations. There's strict statutory language, and although in and of itself it's fairly subjective, at least we've been applying it. And if it were a combination of parcels, more than one parcel, it seems to me lends itself to this process. So I just throw that out there as a possible modification, that we're talking about a combination of at least 2.
I guess one of my questions would be, if somebody came forward and wanted to do something like this, Part D, like 1 or 2, and already we think it would be a long shot for them to do that, then what's the intent of putting that language in?
It's a great question.
So,
So it's actually been my experience when I was community development director that we would find development proposals that had merit that didn't meet, say, a size threshold, right? But they were developments that were worth considering. And it was really our own code that was in the way of something ultimately that was good, not even being able to be considered. So this is a little bit of a release valve that if there's something that has merit to be considered that would otherwise not be allowed by the code, that it's got a way in. And again, it's the same thing. It does not require the PCZBA to recommend approval. It does not require you to approve it. But if it has merit and it's something that you as a village want to look at, this lets that happen. or could let it happen. Wouldn't necessarily be carte blanche for anybody.
No, but it sounds like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you get to that point, then you've talked to staff already, and a developer would only, under these circumstances, proceed if he or she thought they had a good chance of success. No one would go through this process, which Ben just said, is more onerous than not.
I agree completely with Ben
So
that,
why would anyone, a developer, particularly in the economic climate we're in today, 75 basis points increase today, and 2 more to come. So I don't see why anyone would go through this if they didn't, but those weren't my concerns. My concerns were that we've added 2 residential districts, and that I agree with Susan and George's comments, but I'm really troubled by D5. There's a need for flexible application of the zoning standards to incorporate unique design elements. That's about as nebulous and vague as it gets. I don't
and
even
that's
know-
that outlet valve that I was
don't
just
even know what that
describing, and we could
means.
certainly tighten that up if there was a concern there, or delete it.
It's so subjective as to be meaningless. It has no meaning. How could the PCZBA judge that standard? It's impossible. It shouldn't be there. You said this is specific. There's so much generalized language in here that it's like a gift with a big red bow on it. And I'm troubled by that, because I think every time that there's, like, the absence of or as opposed to and, those kind of drafting things, we need those in there, but any language that's vague should be stricken.
Okay.
Because it's just it's the door they are looking to walk through. But I think, questions have been raised about R5, about density, and to me, a PRD's function in a case like Stonebridge is that it's a large piece of property, and the 6-acre minimum had a function, which was to say we are using this and for large parcels where density wouldn't be as much of an issue as it would be in areas of the village that already have existing density, or, to George's point, have single-family zoning. And I know the trend in certain places in the United States, but I think that this can create some really serious conflicts. I've been in this room over the years for some pretty hairy meetings about development or not development, and this is, to me, when we to Susan's point, are just going all the way to the other end and saying there's really no acreage limitation. We're inviting that, whether this process is challenging or not for people. I think we're just inviting increased density, and I think we have to ask ourselves, is that something that we want? Because sometimes you can think you want it, like on Block 2 on the North Avenue side, and if you look at the proposal that's there, it's over 100,000 square feet. So that's concerning to me. Density can be a boon, and it can be a real problem.
I acknowledge and respect that concern, and if we need to change parts of this or delete parts, absolutely. What I would say before the next question is that part of the approach here, part of what you have to do is take a step back and not look at one line or one page of the document. If you look at that flow chart, the little flow chart that's got the process in it, one of my personal strong recommendations that's in here is this informal workshop, this informal meeting that happens at the very beginning of the process. And the way we've set it up is that it be a joint meeting held with PCZBA and ARB, so that they could see what the developer is proposing before they get too far into it, when they're still primarily on the back of the napkin, and come to the village and say, here's what I'm thinking, right? Again, I typically recommend that these be done by the recommending bodies rather than you all on the village board. There are other places, and I should tell you that Peter is an advocate of this meeting being held at or with you all as well. There's, again, a lot of ways to do it. But the reason for that is that this person with these ideas that are too dense or won't fly, or they're just not who we are, they come before you and they say, here's what I'm thinking, what do you think? And I have been part of communities that use this process. And when they get the feedback that tells them, you are, it just kind of describes what you just did, right? You are completely out of bounds with who we are. Yeah, this idea of this unique design element is lovely, but you don't meet the rest of these thresholds. The idea, and the reason, frankly, that the development community is fond of this is they find out very early on that they don't meet what the village wants.
And that's happened.
And, well, and they,
Multiple times.
and they go away, and honestly, they go away appreciative of the fact that they didn't go through that whole process that Ben was alluding to, only to find out that they were not going to meet the standards and there was no way that anybody wanted them around. That's one of my strongest recommendations in this, is that initial informal meeting, because a lot of developers will find out, or a lot of people with even the smaller projects, I use developer for everything from a house to, right? They will find out that what they're looking at doing is just not in keeping with what Lake Bluff wants as spelled out in the code. Not that you can just randomly, arbitrary and capricious, how'd I do? Arbitrary and capriciously say no, right? But you can certainly point to all the standards they don't meet.
Thank you. I just wanted to jump in because I'm hearing the comments and having some of the same questions. And in reading through this, I too had a lot of notes, George. One of your questions are leading to where do we have in our code, or where in this plan do we have the counterbalance? So if someone comes in and it's crazy, what right do we have to say no? That was shorthand for something inappropriate. But if we move to page 15, there's a pretty good example, section, or number 3, 1 through 6, standards for preliminary development plan approval. That sums up what everyone is saying right now. So maybe we need to filter this process knowing that we are also delineating reasons why we would say no. If that makes sense.
It does, and that's why in response to the village president's comment, I said, in a lot of ways, who holds the cards is in fact the village, because if these standards aren't met, then the answer is no, and that's ultimately your recommendation and your vote, and that's the way this process is set up. And if there is need to, and again, the standards come from any number of places. You also have to meet the special use standards that exist in the code now. So these standards come from, again, I'm going to cross the line, I apologize, right? Illinois is famous for its LaSalle factors, and many of you have probably heard of these LaSalle factors, right? Where there are specific standards that have to be met so that a municipality can say no, or yes. What's interesting is these are never yes or no questions. These are always, I describe them as things you should be thinking about. These are reasons you vote yes or no. These are, so there's not always a clear-cut answer, right? But what these standards that you just alluded to, you'll notice that the other thing that is required to be met as part of this is this description all the way up at the purpose statement and the description of what we want to be. There's a page and a half of what is Lake Bluff that we're trying to explain to people. And clearly, and again, I'm just going to use the example. I respect your concern, George. The example of somebody wanting to do a 4-flat in a single-family neighborhood doesn't meet any of those. And it gives you the cards you need to say no. That's the intent of the process. I hear the concerns. I share them, absolutely understand them. But this is not a document that somebody reads and then gets a building permit. This is a document that sets up a process and a structure by which you all go through and, the developer side would be great. If the developer were sitting here going, what are you going to make me go through all this stuff for, right? It's a process that goes through, and again, the sections for community input as well, that they have to show you that they meet those standards. And if they just don't meet the standards, and that's why there's so many extra standards here beyond special use, specific to the PRD, specific to that description in the first section, there's a lot of ways that, without being arbitrary and capricious, without being very much following the standards, that you all can look at them either at the final approval or at that very first preliminary meeting and go, no, this is not who we are. Didn't you read section 1, Mr. Developer? Right? That's why all that's in there. So again, I understand the concerns as they come from these individual statements, and if there are things that need to go or be consolidated, or absolutely agree, we can do that. But I encourage you to kind of look at the whole in terms of how the village gets to manage the process. Step off my little soapbox now.
But, Mike, it's not sinking in for me at all, because the way this applicability section is written, this literally, the way it's written here, would allow someone to come in for any lot in the village, for any lot, anywhere. And why would we want to have, you could have changed this applicability section to just say, it applies to any lot in the village. It's so broad when you have statements like, would require more than one variation or modification. I don't even know what the word modification means in the zoning code. It's just too broad for my
I hear you,
taste.
and that's the way it's written, and I agree with it. And if we all decide we want to take some of those out, I have no problem with it. Those are policy decisions, and, you know, to the extent we get there and change that's not a constructing problem. We can do that.
I actually have a question for the PCZBA. Let's say we removed that section D out of the code. Let's say we removed it. And somebody did want to build like a two-flat on a double lot or something. Is there a process for that? Could they come forward? Could they come forward to the PCZBA and say, I'm interested in doing that? Is that, I'm sorry, I should probably know more, but is that a special use permit, or could a developer even do that? Does anybody know?
Yeah,
Glenn's gonna answer this.
I guess there's the simplest answer, which is important to bear in mind here, is no, there's not a process, but yes, there's always a process. I mean, a developer always has some form of relief to ask, and it's
for
very,
text
very
amendment.
difficult, to prevent someone from asking. By way of illustration, you'll recall late 2019, early 2020, there was a development proposal on Block 3 that proposed to exceed the height limit. And there were multiple, public meetings to consider essentially that proposal and that policy discussion, even though by the text of the ordinance, that could not be built. And so some of it is, just a question of, is it better to, what are the terms under which that discussion
Right.
happens?
So we could, essentially, if we wanted to, we could remove that language, and then it could just be on a per base, like if somebody comes forward and asks us, then we could deal with it then.
You could, but I think one of the original goals of this exercise and review of this is to help the process be predictable, but also to help facilitate to get what the village wants to see for development on properties, right? So the idea is to create a pathway to facilitate the type of development the village wants to see on properties of this scale. And the question is how many, what's that universe, I think is what really is focused on. But so I think the goal was to really do that and to try to facilitate outcomes that are desired. And so if you don't give them a clear pathway to do that, and this one is, I think, on a continuum of control, this document as drafted is more controlling than what's on the books today.
Right.
Except when it
But I
comes to the
think-
size of the lot, that's the problem.
Right.
It isn't more controlling, it's less. George is right. It means you can put you could build an apartment building on my 18,000 square foot lot.
No,
Right,
it
not
doesn't
my
mean,
house.
no, it's not
What
as
I'm
of right.
saying
It
is you can
doesn't.
apply for it. There are lots of large lots here, and I think I'm wondering why we just threw the baby out with the bathwater with the acreage limit. I don't get it.
Well, that was the direction of the group to begin with.
No, it was, the
Well, it
direction of the
was.
group was, the question I raised that I never got an answer to was what was the genesis of the 6 acres? And then we talked about 3 acres, but I don't think we ever, as a group, agreed that anything goes on any lot. I get what the goal is here. The goal is to facilitate development in the village, that's clear. But at what cost to the village?
think the
Because
goal is
George is 100% correct. This means that anywhere you could potentially, if you choose to, on a large enough lot, my question for you, Michael, is going back to the standards, tell me how a 4-flat would not comport with any of those standards, because I don't know how it would. When you say the uses proposed will not be detrimental to present and potential surrounding uses, how could a 2-flat or a 4-flat be detrimental? That's a subjective standard. So the developers and the realtors in town aren't gonna think so. They're gonna think it's great. The comprehensive plan asks for multifamily housing and seniors staying in place. So how does that run afoul of it? I don't see how it does.
What I would suggest is that we look to where we want to draw the line, right? And if it's 3 acres or 6 acres, that's one way to do it. That's perfectly reasonable. What you can do is we could figure out some other way that smaller parcels, if you want, can be part of that analysis. It could have to be a minimum of, even if it's a full acre, it's getting a little bit to your point. The other thing we could be very specific about is that there are no use variations, that there might be able to be mixed uses of developments on properties over a certain size. We can craft this to do what we want. And I hear what you're saying. What you're saying is there's just way too many opportunities in here for a developer to come through and ask. And once you give them the chance to ask, well, then you've opened the door for them walking through the process and potentially being successful. As I think you've heard some of us say, that's kind of a long throw, but I hear you saying, we're not willing to take that risk. Is that a fair summary of the concerns I'm hearing? If it is, we need to fix this page so that it's more specific to the concerns that are here. But again, to take a step back and talk about.
Maybe there might be a way to actually hear the room a little bit differently, that is to say, what don't you want to see?
Yeah.
From Kate's standpoint, from Suzanne's standpoint, Joy's standpoint, from your standpoint, what are the things that are just not plainly acceptable in this text?
I'd throw in one more thing that I had a question about, which is why are churches and houses of worship and schools included in this? A church and a house of worship in a PRD, like for example, let's say Presbyterian Homes decided they wanted to expand into Lake Bluff and they built a church on there. So that parcel is off the tax rolls. So if we're encouraging development, why would we want to include in this process anything that would be not pay into, I didn't understand why that was included in there. That's a technical thing, I'm just.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The logic behind it is that they're complementary uses, that they're the sorts of things that might have a connection to a residential development. And so the thought was, maybe these things would have some value in being part of, even a school, kids walking to school, that sort of thing. So the idea was to make it feasible to incorporate those into the development. Whether or not we want to do it or not, again, that's.
And I know of places like the Presbyterian Homes in Evanston has a worship facility on the premises.
Right.
So that makes sense. I just wondered why it was in there.
So I don't know that you're getting the sense of the group, but what I remember asking for was some language that we could actually get our heads around, and that's exactly what we have. So I feel like this is a much more productive discussion than the last one we had, simply because of the.
Now you can play editor.
Ability to focus. Well, the ability to focus on where the real pain points are.
Yep.
And so I think, to your credit, we've gotten that kind of level of focus now for the first time in discussing what this looks like. The purpose of the underlying zoning code is some certainty for the surrounding neighbors, right? When you move into one empty lot, one empty parcel, you think, it's probably going to get another single family on it, and it'll be within the same zoning requirement, and if they need some variations, they've got to go through a process to do the variations. I think that calculus changes a bit, and Kate, you may disagree with me, but I think it changes a bit when you move into two empty lots. I think there's a rationale for saying, if not an acreage minimum, a number of parcels minimum, because if what the owner of two parcels, their only option is to go in and create two single-family homes, unless they have an avenue to make the parcels into one, or in any event, it strikes me that at a minimum, we'd want to be talking about two parcels, in part to help the zoning code do exactly what at least it's designed to do, which is get some predictability to people who would be neighbors of that parcel. Some certainty. And nothing in life is certain, but it strikes me there's a very different calculus that someone must do when they move into one beside one empty lot than when they move into two empty lots side by side.
Any more questions?
I'm sorry. Just one other suggestion is, we need to refine for everyone the definition of what a parcel is. Just the way the village evolved, almost every single property going down Center Avenue all the way to the lake is made up of multiple
Yeah.
parcels. They're all, multiple lots. There may only be one zoning lot. We need to explain what that is right up front also.
And the subdividing by right is also, so in, at least in my neighborhood, there's a piece of property that, because of its size, has applied for and gotten subdivision by the previous owner, but the current owner intends on keeping it that way, but it doesn't have to be two single-family homes because it's so big that something larger could potentially be built there as defined this way. So again, George is correct. What is the definition? Because I'm also under the impression that when you purchase a two-lot side-by-side, like at 512 Sunrise, then that becomes one contiguous lot, parcel, et cetera. So being super specific about that, because you're right. I think zoning is about creating expectations.
So I'm envisioning a grid, and we can go back and work on this, and it's probably gonna be workshop 2.0, right? We're gonna be back here. But before we go, I'm thinking there's a column of, there's a category of properties like 6 acres or larger shall go through this process. There's certain properties that shall not be permitted to go, and then there's the may. And so what that looks like is kind of put together a grid on that. That's what I'm envisioning.
And what that really means is, from a process standpoint, tonight might not be the last workshop on crafting this document. We need to go through an additional review phase to voice what we want to see, what we don't want to see, what is a may or a shall or a definitely not in that text. I don't know how you guys feel about that, but
I think that's a good idea.
I think this is where we are. And we have waited for a long time to get this document right, and we got in trouble. And it's time to get this right. So I suggest we go for another round of review.
Yes.
And I think, but before that other round of review, we need to provide those comments to Drew and to Michael, all of us, and so that we come to another one of these meetings where we can say, okay, we like that. We can go to the next step for a community review.
So I have one or two more specific questions, and one of them is the absence of the word "and." I think it was raised in section 1017(8)(b). Ought there be an "and" between those clauses? And if not, where's the "or"?
Yeah, I agree. That's a big thing for.
I read it, and sensically, I think we need "and," but I think it's a fair question.
It is an "and," you're right.
It is intended to be. It's not clear, you're right, but it is
Okay.
intended to be.
I'd like to just make sure that we clarify that. I thought it was, but I think that was my only other, I know, I had one other question. I know one concern has been raised repeatedly by at least one person in the community about the PRD not having a supermajority requirement, current statute. I don't see it here. I take it that that's not intended to be part of this statute, as it wasn't in the other statute. Okay. That's,
I had one last question about the process in 1017(7). We talk about the community workshop in the beginning of the process. When we talk about that being optional, I think personally, myself, I'd like to see that not be optional. I'd like to see, and I don't know how the rest of this group feels about that, but I feel like the earlier we can get some community involvement in what we're doing, the better. It shows transparency, and it also shows that we're interested in what residents have to say about what we're doing. So I can't quite remember. I'm sure we discussed that at some point, like why that was, maybe it was, we decided it was too early in the process to really, like, it's optional if the builder wants to do it or the developer. But that to me seems important to include as something they have to do.
I agree.
Trustee,
Any more comments in the room?
Did you want to?
I guess Trustee Ryder, one important point I'd highlight in response to your question. So does this require a supermajority vote to enact? No. The way this is written with its density language, which we can come to, it really encourages people to rezone to get the level of density they need. And by statute, that does involve a supermajority vote.
I would just make one comment generally about the community workshop, whether or not it's optional or required. I think either is fine. I generally suggest to clients that it be something that the applicant, the developer, do independent of the village, right? Because when I was CD director, we always avoided those meetings like the plague, because we didn't want to give the impression to the residents that the village had a position on this yet. We're not there supporting it, we're not there looking. It's something for the developer to learn and for the community to learn, so that there's the future steps are more informed. So that's just
Good idea.
that initial meeting, that informal review is a public meeting. It's not a public hearing, but it's a public meeting. And so what some communities would do is they would set out perhaps a courtesy notice, just to let people know what's going on. That's different. That is obviously a village meeting.
Thanks.
Super helpful, really. Dan?
Glad, there's
Really?
a lot, I mean, baby steps, but is there anything, is there a quick, can you just maybe go around the room really quick to get the hit list from each, maybe like a critical issue or something from everybody? Is that possible?
Absolutely. And we are short of time, so let's make that valuable for you.
Somebody else.
Let's go
I've
around the
spoken
room.
plenty.
Deb?
Debbie?
I guess my question would be to think about what the ouch is in terms of what is the smallest or whatever, because I can see this being a useful tool the way it's written right now as, and maybe it was a pre-COVID thing, but pre-COVID people were looking at the acre and a half kind of properties and saying, you know, that's more land than I really want. You know, could some of those be subdivided into, into two,
Yeah.
excuse me, 3/4 acre properties or something. So, is that an ouch going forward, or is that something that could be a valid number? Because to me, I think there could well be a market back for that as opposed to acre and a half properties. So, but let's get a consensus on where we are in the village on that process, so.
Having been on the zoning board for a while and gone through Block 3 several times, I feel keeping an open door to developers is not the right way to go. I think we have to be more specific, as we've been talking here, of what what the village wants. I don't think we have to have a public meeting to know that people don't want 40-foot buildings in the downtown district with multiple families. So I think, as we've discussed here, to refine this, to really, I don't think the village should say no to everything that comes through, but I think the developers have to know what the village will stand for before they even approach the village. And that's why I agree that we need to tighten this up.
Cool.
Nothing further?
I don't have anything further for the moment, but I'd like to let this sift through a little
Sure.
bit before later.
I so agree with what Commissioner Elliott mentioned about that we're in the driver's seat and we need to help facilitate the best outcome. I do like the idea of the process being a little bit more, have the AB, the Architect Review Board and us and really have those questions. If this gets tightened up a little bit, I could see how that would be very beneficial to have both there in a meeting. it's sometimes difficult. We've had this a few times, a few months ago, where somebody came in clearly not prepared even to have this preliminary discussion, and he didn't want to spend any money to move forward because he wasn't even sure that it was a good enough idea. And, you know, luckily he had somebody, an investor there to sort of encourage him along because he was still at that napkin stage, you know, so, you know, there's something that if we can guide, I guess that's just the double sword, right? I mean, you want them to come forward, you want to help guide, but at the same time, if they're not truly prepared,
That's the first
you know,
ask
you
that's in here.
cycle back to that beginning, and I'm sure the village helps in that regard too. But anyhow, I think it's great to see something tangible and, you know, tighten it up as we go.
I think the fact that you put together a tremendous draft is very, very beneficial. The comments you've heard tonight, I think, are tremendous, very broad-reaching, but very significant. I was concerned, obviously, about parcel size, and density, and height, and that was covered. But the insight that you gained tonight is tremendous.
Thanks.
Thank you. On our board, Kate?
Just to, I think we should stick with something coming up with what Drew said about maybe a chart a lot like the density chart for acreage, so that we can have some better, clear understanding. I think Jill's right. The more direction we give, the better. I don't think we should be afraid to set strict parameters so that we, not only do residents have expectations, but the advisory boards and the Board of Trustees also do, and developers do too, so that they know whether they can move forward here with their proposal instead of coming here, wasting staff's time, their time, our time. And so that we can maintain the character of this village that we have all bought into, I think, and that we're trying to get other people to buy into. If we want to perpetuate that, we have to have the courage of our conviction and not be afraid to set those parameters strictly.
Thank you, Kate.
I think I've said enough. I just want to reiterate that I think these workshops are tremendously helpful, and they always create robust conversations that help move us along and help us to create things that are really beneficial for the village. So I appreciate everyone being here tonight.
Yeah. I echo what you said, Joy. Thanks.
Thank you for reading 22 pages of fun.
It's really helpful.
Just really quick, so for everybody's sake, some of you may remember on the PCZBA, we did go through a process for the downtown to try to develop development guidelines to help set expectations and for desired product type and height, and we went through that process, but it didn't reach the finish line, and actually the resulting outcome of going through that process was an amendment to the comprehensive land use plan. It did not result in guidelines to help say this is what we want, so don't knock on our door unless you're doing this, right? We went through a process and it didn't result in what was expected or intended, but that's what happens. It's the process, is where we ended up. I just want to say that is an option that you can do as part of this in conjunction with this, but I think this sets up what everybody's trying to get is try to set up a really tight process with the village in control, right?
So Michael, I really like what you did in terms of process to get to a process to drive our community development. So I love that. The devil is in the detail, as we all looked at that development.
Agreed.
And so I don't see actually this process to be stalled or going backward. I see it actually going forward. But we all need to actually address the detailed points we have noticed. George, Kate, Susan, we need to provide those comments back. So we also need a process to address your document. And I would say direct this to Drew. And we need to be proactive. And of course, we'll have another meeting. When should we have the next meeting?
After we get through all the comments and see how many
So let's
red
put a
ink
timeline to
pins
that.
we're going to go through. Yeah.
6 weeks, 2 months, 1 month, what should be best?
It gets tougher to meet in the summer and get everybody together, but let's.
I think there is urgency, or we need to put a sense of urgency. So 6 weeks?
Sure.
So let's get on.
End of July.
This
End of
is
July.
somewhere.
Vacation.
So let's
You gotta be
please
here.
have
We're
I'm
here.
sorry, project management. Let's put all comments forward to Drew in the next 4 weeks to 6 weeks.
No, get comments today or,
Yeah.
yeah, like this week, if while they're fresh, you've written them down, leave them with us or email us. Yeah.
And let's move forward with this process, that I find very helpful. Thank you very much. So
Thank you.
at this point, I would welcome.
Can you know what, you should ask for any public comment on this topic, really quick.
Any public comment on this process?
Anyone online who wants to make public comment?
Appreciate it.
Anybody raising their
No one
hand?
is raising their hand to comment on this topic.
I didn't get it. Nobody?
No, sir.
Okay, so at this point, I would welcome a motion to adjourn this meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you very much.
All in favor.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, so we are adjourned. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
So
all.
for those in the room for the next part of the segment of the meeting, a few moments, they're going to shuffle around and they'll get it underway. Great, thank you. You bet.